Grandma, maybe it's time you stopped expecting so much from people, my daughter-in-law once told me with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. I didn't answer her then. 3 months later, I finally understood what she meant. My name is Margaret Sullivan. I'm 72 years old, a widow, a mother, and a grandmother. Last Christmas Eve, I sat alone at a dining table set for 10 people. At 6 o'clock, everything was perfect. The turkey rested on the kitchen counter, golden brown and filling the house with the smell of rosemary and butter. The mashed potatoes were still warm. The cranberry sauce sat in my favorite glass bowl, the one my late husband George had bought me during a trip to Vermont more than 30 years ago. The Christmas tree sparkled in the corner of the living room. Wrapped presents waited underneath. Stockings hung above the fireplace. Everything was ready. Everyone was supposed to arrive by 6:30. Daniel, my son, his wife Ashley, their 2 children, my niece Rebecca and her husband, even my younger sister Linda. By 6:45, the driveway was still empty. I checked my phone. Nothing. No messages. No missed calls. At 7:15, I told myself traffic was probably worse than expected. At 7:45, I reheated the gravy. At 8 o'clock, I turned down the Christmas music because the cheerful songs suddenly felt too loud inside an empty house. I called Daniel. Straight to voicemail. I called Ashley. No answer. I sent a text asking if everything was okay. No reply. The candles slowly burned lower. The turkey cooled. The house that had felt warm and festive only hours earlier now felt enormous and silent. I sat down and stared at the empty chairs. 10 place settings. 10 folded napkins. 10 untouched glasses. I don't know how long I sat there before my phone vibrated. For a moment, relief washed over me. I thought it was Daniel finally calling. Instead, it was a social media notification. Ashley had posted new photos. My hands trembled as I opened them. There they were. Daniel. Ashley. The children. Rebecca. Linda. All smiling. All together. Snow-covered mountains stretched behind them. The caption read, "Best Christmas ever. So grateful for family and beautiful memories." My chest tightened. They weren't delayed. They weren't lost. They weren't coming. They were on vacation together. Every single one of them. And somehow, I was the only person who hadn't known. I kept scrolling through the photos, trying to understand what I was seeing. Then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Standing in the background of one picture was a man I recognized immediately. He wasn't family. He wasn't a friend. He was the attorney who had handled George's estate after my husband passed away. Suddenly, Christmas dinner no longer felt like the biggest mystery of the night. Something else was happening. Something I didn't understand yet. And for the first time in months, I felt something stronger than sadness. I felt determined to learn the truth. I barely slept that night. The photographs remained open on my tablet long after midnight, glowing softly in the darkness of my living room. Every time I looked away, my eyes drifted back to the same image. Not to Daniel. Not to Ashley. Not even to my grandchildren. My attention kept returning to the man standing near the edge of the frame. Thomas Reynolds. George's attorney. The same attorney who had helped settle my husband's estate 4 years earlier. It made no sense. Thomas was not a family friend. He had never attended birthdays, holidays, or reunions. He had always been polite, professional, and distant. Yet there he was, smiling beside my family in Aspen while I sat alone at home. The next morning, Christmas Day arrived quietly. No phone calls. No messages. No apologies. Snow covered my front yard in a thin white blanket. I stood at the kitchen window holding a cup of coffee and watched a pair of cardinals land near the bird feeder George had built years ago. For a few moments, I tried to focus on them instead of the ache in my chest. Around noon, my sister Linda finally sent a text. "Merry Christmas. Hope you are having a peaceful day." That was it. No explanation. No mention of Aspen. No acknowledgement that I had been left behind. I stared at the message for several seconds before setting my phone face down on the table. The silence said more than any argument could. Throughout the afternoon, memories began surfacing one after another. Small moments I had ignored for years. Ashley changing holiday plans at the last minute. Birthday invitations arriving after the event had already happened. Family dinners I somehow never heard about until days later. At the time, I had convinced myself they were accidents. Misunderstandings. Scheduling mistakes. Now they looked different. They looked connected. By evening, I found myself standing in George's old study. The room had hardly changed since he passed away. His bookshelf remained exactly as he had left it. His reading chair still sat beside the window. A faint scent of cedar lingered in the air. I opened the lower cabinet of his desk and removed a small metal box containing important documents. Insurance papers. Property records. Investment statements. The same files I reviewed every year. As I sorted through them, something caught my attention. A large envelope sat beneath several folders. My name was written on the front in George's handwriting. Margaret. The sight of it made my heart skip. I was certain I had never opened it before. Slowly, I sat down in his chair and ran my fingers across the envelope. It had been sealed for years. Why had I never noticed it? Why had George left it there? Outside, the winter wind brushed softly against the windows. The house felt unusually still. For a long moment, I simply stared at the envelope resting in my lap. Then I looked again at the Aspen photograph on my tablet. Thomas Reynolds stood there beside my family. Suddenly, a thought entered my mind that I could not ignore. What if the photograph and the envelope were connected? What if George had known something I did not? For several minutes, I simply sat there holding the envelope. The paper felt fragile beneath my fingers, as though time itself had been folded inside it. George had always been organized. He labeled everything. Every file. Every receipt. Every photograph. If he had placed this envelope in his desk and written my name on it, there was a reason. I carefully broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. The date at the top stopped me cold. It had been written nearly 6 months before George passed away. My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, it means I am no longer there to explain things myself. I smiled sadly when I saw his handwriting. For a moment, I could almost hear his voice. Steady. Calm. Reassuring. The way it had always been during difficult times. I continued reading. George wrote that he had spent years watching changes inside our family. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. Just small things. Conversations that stopped when he entered the room. Decisions being made without including us. Certain attitudes that worried him. He explained that he had met privately with Thomas Reynolds several times during his final year. Together, they reviewed every aspect of our estate plan. Then I reached the sentence that made me stop breathing for a moment. If there ever comes a day when you find yourself isolated, excluded, or treated as though you no longer matter, I want you to contact Thomas immediately. Everything has already been prepared. I read the line 3 times. Isolated. Excluded. Treated as though you no longer matter. It felt as though George had somehow witnessed Christmas Eve years before it happened. My eyes moved lower on the page. There was no anger in his words. No accusations. Only concern. He wrote that people sometimes reveal their true character when they believe they no longer need someone. He hoped he was wrong. He prayed he was wrong. But he wanted me protected if he was not. Attached to the letter was a business card with Thomas Reynolds's direct number written on the back. Beneath it, George had added one final note in blue ink. Trust actions more than words. Always. The room felt strangely quiet after I finished reading. Outside, snow continued falling across the yard. Inside, something was shifting inside me. For weeks after George died, I had felt lost. For years after that, I had focused on keeping peace in the family. Making excuses? Giving second chances? looking away from uncomfortable truths. But now I found myself thinking about Ashley's photograph again. About Daniel ignoring my calls. About my sister's empty text message. About Thomas standing beside them in Aspen. None of it felt accidental anymore. The next morning, I called the number on the business card. Thomas answered after the second ring. There was a brief silence when I introduced myself. Then his voice softened. Margaret. I have been wondering when you might call. My hand tightened around the phone. He sounded neither surprised nor confused. It was as though he had been expecting this conversation for a very long time. And in that moment, I realized George had left me far more than a letter. He had left me a path forward. I simply had not known it existed until now. Thomas asked if I would be comfortable meeting him in person. 2 days later, I drove to his office downtown. The same building where George and I had signed countless documents over the years. The same waiting room with leather chairs and framed photographs of the city skyline. Everything looked familiar, yet somehow different. Perhaps because I was different. Thomas greeted me warmly and led me into a private conference room. A thick folder rested on the table between us. He sat down, folded his hands, and looked at me carefully. There was sympathy in his eyes, but there was also something else. Relief. As though a burden he had carried for years was finally being lifted. For several moments neither of us spoke. Then he opened the folder. Inside were documents I had never seen before. Additional estate records. Trust agreements. Property schedules. Notes written in George's handwriting. My husband had not simply updated his will. He had spent months building safeguards. Thomas explained that George became concerned after noticing repeated attempts by certain family members to discuss future inheritances while he was still alive. Nothing illegal. Nothing dramatic. Just conversations that left him uneasy. Questions about ownership. Questions about assets. Questions about timelines. George never accused anyone of wrongdoing. But he believed in preparing for possibilities. Thomas slid one document toward me. It outlined a trust that held several investments, commercial properties, and financial accounts. My eyes widened as I read the figures. I knew George had been successful. I knew we were comfortable. But I had never realized the full extent of what he had built over 4 decades. Then Thomas pointed to a specific section. The trust was entirely under my control. Every decision. Every distribution. Every future transfer. No one else had authority. Not Daniel. Not anyone. I looked up slowly. Why did George never tell me this? Thomas smiled sadly. Because he hoped none of it would ever matter. He wanted your family to love you because you were their mother. Not because they expected something from you. The words settled heavily in the room. I thought about the empty chairs on Christmas Eve. I thought about unanswered phone calls. I thought about years of excuses I had accepted without question. Thomas hesitated before opening another section of the file. There were records of several meetings from the past year. Then he showed me something unexpected. A reservation list from the Aspen Resort. My eyes immediately found the names. Daniel. Ashley. Linda. Rebecca. The children. And at the bottom, Thomas Reynolds. I looked at him in confusion. Thomas nodded. They invited me months ago. Ashley said it would be a family celebration and thought I might enjoy the trip. I never accepted. My stomach tightened. Then why were you in the photograph? Thomas reached into the folder and placed a printed image on the table. It was the original photograph before it appeared online. His figure was nowhere in the picture. Ashley had added him digitally before posting it. Suddenly the room felt very quiet. She wanted me to see that image. She wanted me to believe something. I just did not know what yet. But for the first time, I realized Christmas had not been an accident. It had been a message. And now I intended to find out exactly why it had been sent. The drive home felt different. Not because anything around me had changed, but because something inside me had. For years I had lived as though my purpose was to keep everyone comfortable. I hosted holidays. I remembered birthdays. I mailed cards. I checked in when someone was sick. I filled every silence with understanding and every disappointment with excuses. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped asking whether those efforts were being returned. That evening, I walked through my front door and looked around the house with new eyes. The rooms were quiet. The decorations still glowed softly in the living room. Wrapped gifts remained beneath the tree exactly where I had placed them. A few days earlier, those gifts had felt like reminders of rejection. Now they felt like something else. Evidence. Evidence that I had shown up. That I had cared. That I had done my part. I brewed a cup of tea and sat beside the window. Snow covered the neighborhood in a clean blanket of white. For the first time since Christmas Eve, I did not check my phone. I did not wonder whether Daniel would call. I did not wait for Ashley to explain herself. Instead, I opened a notebook and began making a list. At the top of the page, I wrote a simple question. What do I want? The answer did not come immediately. For years, every decision had revolved around someone else. Daniel's needs, the grandchildren's schedules, family traditions, expectations. I stared at the blank page for several minutes before writing my first answer. Peace. Then another. Freedom. Then another. A life that did not depend on whether someone else included me. Over the following weeks, I began making small changes. I met with a financial advisor recommended by Thomas. I reviewed every property, every account, every investment. I learned things about our finances that George had quietly managed for decades. The more I learned, the more confident I became. Then I did something I had never seriously considered before. I visited a coastal retirement community in Florida. The property overlooked the Gulf. Palm trees lined the walking paths. Residents gathered for morning coffee, book clubs, and volunteer programs. There was laughter everywhere. Not forced laughter. Genuine laughter. People building lives instead of waiting for invitations. I spent 3 days there. By the time I boarded my flight home, a decision had already been made in my heart. Back in town, I placed my house on the market. Not because I had to. Because I wanted to. The house carried beautiful memories, but memories did not live in walls. George had taught me that. Life moved forward. The sale happened faster than expected. Within weeks, boxes filled the rooms. Furniture was donated. Family photographs were carefully packed. Through it all, my phone remained strangely quiet. Daniel never asked why real estate photos appeared online. Ashley never called. No one seemed to notice that my entire life was changing. And as winter slowly gave way to spring, I realized something important. The people who had left me behind had no idea they were losing me completely. By March, Florida already felt like home. My mornings began with long walks along the waterfront paths. I joined a reading group on Tuesdays. I volunteered twice a week at a local community center. For the first time in years, my calendar was filled with things I genuinely looked forward to. The strange part was how little I thought about Daniel and Ashley. Not because I had stopped loving them. A mother never really does. But because I had finally stopped arranging my life around people who rarely made room for me in theirs. Then one afternoon, everything changed. I was returning from lunch with a friend named Eleanor when my phone rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I stared at it for several seconds before answering. His voice sounded different. Tired. Unsteady. "Mom, how are you?" The question felt oddly formal. As though we were distant relatives instead of mother and son. I told him I was doing well. There was a pause. Then another. Finally he cleared his throat. "We have had a rough few months." I listened quietly. The details emerged slowly. His company had lost several major contracts. A planned expansion had fallen through. Expenses continued rising while revenue moved in the opposite direction. Ashley had started a business project of her own that required significant investment. The returns they expected never materialized. They were not facing disaster, but they were under pressure. Real pressure. The kind that keeps people awake at night. As Daniel spoke, I noticed something missing. He never asked about my move. He never asked how I liked Florida. He never mentioned the house I had sold. The conversation revolved entirely around his situation. When he finished, another silence followed. Then came the question he had really called to ask. Mom, have you been working with Thomas Reynolds recently? I looked out across the water. Small boats drifted slowly in the afternoon sun. Yes, I said calmly. Why? Another pause. Longer this time. We heard there were changes to some of Dad's estate plans. We did not know anything about them. The sentence revealed more than he intended. We heard. Not I heard. We heard. Meaning Daniel and Ashley had been discussing it. Wondering about it. Investigating it. Suddenly several pieces began fitting together. The missing phone calls. The sudden curiosity. The unexpected concern. None of it had appeared until financial problems entered the picture. I felt no anger. Only clarity. George's words returned to me. Trust actions more than words. Always. Daniel continued speaking, but my thoughts drifted elsewhere. 3 months earlier, I had sat alone beside a cold Christmas dinner wondering why I had been forgotten. Now I finally understood something important. I had not been forgotten. I had simply stopped being useful. And now, for reasons neither Daniel nor Ashley fully understood yet, they were beginning to realize that usefulness had never been the most valuable thing I possessed. The calls became more frequent after that. At first, they arrived every few weeks. Then every few days. Daniel always sounded polite. Careful. Measured. He asked about the weather in Florida. He asked whether I had made new friends. He asked if I needed anything. The questions should have felt comforting. Instead, they felt unfamiliar. Like lines from a conversation he had rehearsed before dialing my number. One afternoon, while I was watering plants on my patio, Ashley called for the first time in nearly 4 months. Hearing her voice almost made me stop walking. She spoke warmly. Too warmly. She asked about my health. She told me how much the children missed me. She said everyone had been so busy lately. The explanation arrived without me asking for one. That was what struck me most. People rarely explain themselves unless they feel the need to justify something. I listened quietly. When she finished, I thanked her for calling. Then I wished her a pleasant afternoon and ended the conversation. The next week, Thomas called. He rarely phoned unless something important required attention. This time was no different. He informed me that several inquiries had recently been made regarding portions of George's estate. Nothing inappropriate. Nothing illegal. Requests for clarification. Questions about ownership structures. Questions about future distributions. I thanked him and sat silently after hanging up. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. A few days later, Daniel called again. This time his voice carried a note of urgency. Mom, we have been thinking about visiting. The kids would love to see you. I looked across the courtyard where several residents were gathered around a fountain, laughing as they played cards beneath the afternoon sun. It was a peaceful scene. A scene I never would have experienced if I had remained exactly where everyone expected me to stay. You are welcome to visit, I said. Another pause followed. Then Daniel cleared his throat. We were hoping to talk about some family matters too. There it was. Not the entire reason for the visit, but part of it. Perhaps a large part. That evening, I sat on my balcony watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. I thought about the woman I had been 6 months earlier. The woman who waited beside a decorated table hoping someone would remember her. The woman who measured her worth through invitations and phone calls. She felt very far away now. The next morning, a message appeared from Ashley. She included photographs of the children. Smiling faces. School events. Family outings. Then one final sentence. We really hope you can find it in your heart to give us another chance. I stared at those words for a long time. Not because they angered me, Because they revealed something important. They already knew a line had been crossed. They already knew something valuable had been broken. And for the first time since Christmas, they were beginning to understand that repairing it might not be as simple as asking. 2 weeks later, Daniel and Ashley arrived in Florida. I knew they were coming because Daniel had called twice to confirm the visit. The morning they arrived was warm and bright. Palm trees swayed gently outside my building, and a light breeze carried the scent of the ocean through the courtyard. I met them in the lobby. For a moment, none of us moved. Daniel looked older than I remembered. The confident energy he once carried seemed worn thin. Ashley offered a nervous smile. Even the children appeared quieter than usual. We exchanged hugs. Polite. Careful. Then I invited them upstairs. I had prepared iced tea and a plate of cookies. The same kind I used to make for every family gathering. We sat around my dining table. A smaller table than the one I had left behind, but somehow it felt warmer. Nobody rushed to speak. Finally, Daniel looked down at his hands and broke the silence. "Mom, we owe you an apology." Ashley nodded immediately. Tears appeared in her eyes. She admitted that excluding me from the trip had been intentional. At first, she tried to explain it as a misunderstanding. Then she stopped and shook her head. Even she seemed tired of excuses. The truth came out slowly. They thought I would be upset if I knew about the vacation. They worried I would want to join them. They convinced themselves it would be easier not to tell me at all. Easier. The word lingered in the room. I listened without interrupting. They described months of regret. Difficult conversations. Sleepless nights. Realizing how much damage had been done. Ashley admitted she had posted the photograph knowing I would see it. She claimed she wanted me to feel jealous of the trip. When she said those words, her voice cracked. Daniel looked shocked. It was clear he had not known that part. The children sat quietly beside them, confused by a conversation built from years of adult mistakes. I felt sadness then. Not anger. Not satisfaction. Just sadness. Because the people sitting across from me were not strangers. They were my family. Yet somewhere along the way, they had stopped seeing me as a person with feelings and started seeing me as an obligation that could be postponed whenever something more exciting appeared. Daniel finally looked up. "We want to make things right. We want another chance." Ashley quickly agreed. The children nodded too, though I suspected they only understood part of what was happening. I glanced around my apartment. The photographs on the shelves. The books I had read. The life I had built during the past few months. Then I looked back at them. For years, I would have accepted their apology immediately. I would have rushed to make everyone comfortable. But I was no longer that woman. Instead, I simply thanked them for being honest. And for the first time since they arrived, uncertainty appeared in their eyes. Because they realized forgiveness and restoration were not always the same thing. After they left that evening, I sat alone on my balcony and watched the last traces of sunlight disappear beyond the water. The conversation replayed quietly in my mind. The apologies had been real. The tears had been real. The regret had been real. I believe that. But trust is not rebuilt in a single afternoon. It is rebuilt through time. Through consistency. Through choices. The following morning, Daniel called before boarding his flight home. His voice sounded lighter than it had in months. "Thank you for seeing us, Mom. Thank you for listening." I smiled and told him to have a safe trip. Then I ended the call and returned to my morning routine. A few days later, I received a letter in the mail. Inside was a handwritten note from Ashley. No excuses. No explanations. Just an apology. She admitted she had spent years treating family relationships like obligations that could be postponed whenever something more interesting came along. She admitted she had taken my presence for granted because she assumed I would always be there. Reading those words hurt. But they also brought a strange sense of peace. Because for the first time, someone was speaking honestly. Over the next several weeks, the phone calls continued. The grandchildren called to tell me about school projects and soccer games. Daniel sent photographs from family dinners. Ashley checked in regularly. None of them asked about money. None of them mentioned the estate. None of them brought up property or investments. They simply showed up. Consistently. Quietly. The way families should. One afternoon, I met Thomas for lunch. We sat outside beneath a large umbrella overlooking the marina. After hearing everything that had happened, he smiled. "George would be proud of you, Margaret." I looked down at my iced tea. "Proud of me for what?" Thomas leaned back in his chair. "For finally choosing yourself." His words stayed with me long after lunch ended. Because he was right. The greatest change in my life had not been moving to Florida. It had not been selling the house. It had not been taking control of the estate. The greatest change was learning that my worth did not depend on whether someone invited me, included me, or approved of me. Months later, as another holiday season approached, Daniel called with an invitation. They wanted to visit Florida and spend several days together. This time there were no assumptions. No expectations. Just an invitation. I accepted. When they arrived, we shared meals, walked along the waterfront, and laughed more than we had in years. Nothing was perfect. Families rarely are. But something important had changed. Respect had returned. As for the estate, I kept every arrangement exactly as George intended. The trust remained under my control. The assets remained protected. Some lessons are too valuable to forget. On the final evening of their visit, I stood by the door as everyone prepared to leave. Daniel hugged me tightly. Ashley did too. Then my grandson looked up and asked if I would come back again next year. I smiled and told him I would. After they drove away, I returned to my balcony and watched the sunset spread across the water. The loneliness that once filled my heart was gone. In its place was something stronger. Not revenge. Not victory. Peace. And for the first time in a very long time, peace was enough.